Our next speaker is Dallin Maybee, who is Seneca and Northern Arapaho. He is a multimedia artist who works in a variety of forms, including dance, beadwork, oil painting, jewelry, illustration, and carving. He has won numerous awards, including Best of Show at Santa Fe Indian Market and Cherokee Art Market. His art can be found in private collections and museums such as the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, the Autry Museum, yay, the Heard Museum, and the Portland Art Museum. He was also president of SWAIA, that runs Indian Market. Dallin has a JD from Sandra Day O'Connor, she's gonna have a heck of a time this morning, Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, and is currently Assistant Director, Development at the Native American Rights Fund. Please welcome Dallin.
Okay. All right, thank you, Joe, for that introduction. Appreciate it. I want to start by thanking the Autry for Ben and Brittany's and everybody's efforts to bring these important conversations to the forefront of what we do as artists and as museum professionals. I'm not really a deep thinker, but I do like to think about these things as I try and view the world from my own perspective in a way that makes sense in a cultural context for me and my family and my tribe. But as Joe mentioned, I am Northern Arapaho and Seneca. I grew up on the Cattaraugus Indian Reservation, home of the Seneca Nation of Indians in western New York. But I'm enrolled Arapaho in central Wyoming. I currently live in Colorado. I work for the Native American Rights Fund. We're a nonprofit law firm that specializes in federal Indian law. We get to assert and protect and defend tribal interests and inherent tribal sovereignty. We do a lot of work in sacred site protection. It's important. For too long, Native voices have been a bit marginalized, and the beauty and diversity of our cultures has often been forgotten in history. And I love following academics because, man, it puts me on the spot a little bit, makes me stand a little taller and make sure that what I have to say is a little more focused than it probably would be normally. I kind of wanted to start with this slide because I think it's oftentimes misinterpreted, right? There's a devastating impact from the boarding school experience on our cultures. But one of the narratives that's often forgotten because of that horrific experience is that, you know, we are a living, breathing, evolving culture. For hundreds of years, if not generations, our cultures were constantly evolving to many different things: environment, different types of relationships, adverse and beneficial. There was a lot of things happening in which throughout all that time, artists were able to see and experience and interpret in their own ways, right? This particular experience, you know, there are still relatives of these children who are living today, who bear a burden of trying to process that type of trauma and hopefully find something beneficial from the things that they endured and that they suffered so that we can be here having these types of conversations, right? But there's a diversity in art. This particular presentation is going to explore things like identity, appropriation, appreciation, how we view Native art in historical and contemporary contexts. Joe mentioned a few of the art forms that I engage in, and I do like to believe that I am a multimedia artist. For a long time, I wouldn't accept it, right? I was like, yeah, I just do art. It's one of the many things that I get to do. I felt like art was such a prestigious label, and that my art wasn't good enough, right? But here we are. I started doing art as a way to create my own dance regalia. We did Iroquois social dancing, as well as powwow dancing. And since I had the luxury of coming from two different types of cultures. I thought, man, I've got to participate. It makes me feel good. And even now, even though I'm wildly out of shape, I still try and get out there and tell my own story in my dance. But with over 574 different federally recognized tribes and countless other state recognized tribes, there is a diversity to Native art that we can't possibly explore in a lifetime. But I hope you try. Go to museums, go see the work that Native curators and our allies are producing and telling, because those stories will change your life. You know, I've had the opportunity to travel quite a bit throughout the world to experience many different cultures in many different countries. I'll have to tell you about Mongolia one time and the mare's milk vodka that we all got to partake in. It had a texture to it that was unforgettable. But our cultures are no different, and we are very much a part of the fabric and tapestry of this country. And I'm extremely pleased to see how we're talking about those narratives. My mom often tells me, "You're lucky to grow up in today's day and age, because it wasn't cool to be Native when I was growing up. You didn't tell anybody you were Native." But here we are. So Native American art, how should we view it? This buffalo robe, I'm going to regale you with some very tantalizing tales of the story behind this buffalo robe. Just kidding, it's not that crazy, but I had a law professor who wanted to teach a course on the impact of the train, not just on the law, but on industry and how we define corporations and companies in this country, and that's another conversation for another day. But I titled this one, Conductors of Our Own Destiny. If you look closely, that beadwork strip of the train and the medallions, there's actually a Native guy moving that train forward. Despite the history that we have had, despite the destructiveness of the train on Plains cultures and the bison population, we very much get to decide who we are and how we tell the world about our culture and our experience. And so you see things on here that are very classic, traditional design elements. We're a Sundance culture. So I always represent the sun somewhere in my work because of its importance in our culture. The upside-down teepee represents who we are as Arapaho people. We have stories about how we came from the sky. Some people called us the sky people. But I also have some classic cars. I still own that '69 Impala, cruising across the plains. The individuals following that train, that's my own family. It's my ex-wife, right? But it's my kids. We were in a parade at Arapaho one time. But that's all part of my narrative, right? And what I like to think about is how people explore what they're seeing in here, because everybody walks away with a little bit different experience. Some people love the bison. They love the young, probably female bison and their child. Other people see the cars. Other people just see the design elements. But it speaks to them in a different, very much a different way. Now, contrast that with this buffalo robe. It's a little more contemporary, right? It's got light elements because I'm a big fan of what the sun does for us and gives us. It's got a beaded parade scene, again, in the middle. I went to Standing Rock a couple times to protest with some of my friends and family. The lower scene has a Sundance scene from my participation in our ceremonies. The upper scene is some powwow scenes with some of my friends. But that left side represents community. It represents the cohesiveness of our culture and a value structure that is often very different for people that aren't Arapaho or that aren't Indian. And I like to think about that at times because it does define my worldview, it defines my place in the universe, it defines how I interact with my family and friends, and this hope that it can be positive. The astronaut, Chickasaw astronaut, I thought that was such an incredible experience for me to see the first native go back to the stars from where we came, that I wanted to include it in this very, very contemporary narrative. I used to run this organization that produced Santa Fe Indian Market, and I remember as an artist, I had been showing at Indian Market for, gosh, it's been 21 years now, since maybe 2000, 2001. And we would lament the fact that traditional art forms often were the highly collectible art forms. And it was easy. It was an easy answer to say that. It was easy to say, oh, nobody's buying my work because it's too contemporary, right? But once you really started getting down to the nitty-gritty, yes, you did see very traditional art forms and mediums and techniques, but you also saw very contemporary narratives mixed in with those techniques. I love Kathleen Wall's sculptural figures because they are highly identifiable about where they're from and who they are, but they're whimsical, they're powerful, and they very much tell her story, right? I love seeing people exploring new mediums and techniques despite this antiquated standard that's why I suffered from at times. So we wrote the book. We looked at standards, we looked at the directions Native art was going. We implemented a contemporary art show to give Native artists a voice that needed presentation and for people to experience. I was very, very happy with some of the things that we were able to accomplish there. But it also brought, conversely, a lot of other questions. Well, okay, so you have traditional art, you have contemporary art. Is one better than the other? Which one should we be collecting? Where is the line between the sacred and the profane, between the sacred and the secular, right? Where do artists get away with talking about narratives that are so culturally intertwined with their spirituality that maybe it's not appropriate to tell those stories? And we had instances arise. For example, one tribe approached me and said, hey, or not me, and a former director, but they said, hey, we're going to go take these masks away from this artist. They're a little too close to what we use in our ceremonies. And the director at the time he was relaying, he said, yeah, that's between you and your community members. SWI is just here to give people a venue to tell their story. So things like that do happen. I was presenting at a panel that Atata was putting on. It's the Authentic Tribal Art Dealers Association. And I like the fact that they throw an authentic in there, right? Because maybe there are tribes producing art that isn't authentic. But I might have been a little too contentious for them. One woman, she was angry. She stood up and said, hey, what if they, as we were pushing a new act that would actually protect some of the art leaving collectors' hands, sacred objects that would normally fall under NAGPRA, things like that, from leaving the country and being auctioned off overseas, right? She's like, well, what happens if the tribe decides that all Navajo rugs should be sacred and not sold anymore? And I said, well, yeah, what happens? You just won't sell them anymore, right? I was like, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to lose any sleep if the antique Indian art world decides to disappear overnight. Our objects were made for specific reasons, and they are meant to stay within certain communities. I do believe that a lot of those things were preserved in little different ways, but eventually they make their way home, and we either enjoy them or we put them where they need to be. But I said, and the rug issue, that's entirely up to the tribe to decide. Do I think it'll ever happen? I was like, no, it's, there's a little bit of fear-mongering going on here. We're just talking about the things that tribes have determined need to be where they're supposed to be, and end of story. So now, we've got a lot of contemporary issues that are happening. Appropriation versus appreciation. Is there a line? How do we navigate it? I don't want to be canceled because of my collection, right? Well, the beauty of today is that we can actually talk to people, that there's an accessibility that the internet gives us to make new friends and make new connections and find information that'll help us navigate some of these difficult conversations. If you are sincere, if you are well-intentioned, I do not doubt that man above or creator, whatever you call him, will lead you to where you need to be to help some of those objects come home, right? And I don't want to get too much into this whole appropriation versus appreciation. I think it's pretty fleshed out. There's a lot of great websites, Indian Collective and Eighth Generation, and they'll kind of point you in the right direction. But what I do want to kind of get into a little bit is historic versus contemporary art. A lot of times people tend to view Indian art, this is just a brighter version of the last one. They tend to view Indian art through a historical lens, in a historical context. Thus, the problem with, well, that's not really traditional. Is it still considered Indian art, right? This is totally not traditional other than mediums, techniques, narratives. Oh, wait, maybe it is traditional, right? It's just got an accessibility to some technology and mediums that we didn't have before, maybe. Now, when I created these drums, these are hand drums, right? I thought, oh man, this is great. I might be the first native to ever create a square drum. It was whimsical. I do a lot of whimsical stuff. SpongeBob was a good part of my childhood, so my kids too. But then I went to a Plains Narrative opening at NMEI, and in their permanent collection and on display, there was a square hand drum. It had actually split horns on it. It was by Sitting Bull, the Sitting Bull. Probably used it for ceremony. It had some great designs on there. And at first I was like, oh man, I'm not the first. And I was like, well, but I am in good company, so I guess there's that, right? But what was even more exciting, and I don't know the backstory of that drum. I don't know how he decided that he needed to do a square drum. Maybe it was practicality. Maybe it was too hard to find a frame that he could bend and make a traditional round hand drum. Maybe it was a vision. Maybe some spirits told him, hey, create this drum for some reason to honor a certain being or to call us. I don't know, But what I do know is that he wasn't afraid to do something that was a little different than what you would typically see. And that's the only point I had for this particular slide. So I've talked a little bit about contemporary techniques and saying, hey, is this still Indian art if it's not very native at all? If you look at this piece, there's really almost nothing native about this gas mask, about this commentary on our shared suffering of the pandemic. But when you start to look at it, there are elements that are recognizable. It's horrific that we even have to use gas masks in any art or at all. They were created solely because of death and destruction. And I wanted this piece to talk about that. I wanted it to horrify people. I wanted people to say, I'm not very smart, so I put a skull right on the front, because then I can say, oh, peace, death, it's all right there, right? But when you look at there's a, probably, 1700s, there was a big French influence on the Great Lakes, probably. They saw a lot of floral designs in European aesthetics, and they started to create florals and add them to their beadwork and their bandolier bags. I'm not, and this could be totally wrong, so by all means correct me in the Q&A. But there is a heavy floral influence in Great Lakes work, and I wanted that juxtaposition of beauty to be in this piece. But the florals are the COVID virus, they're a cross-section of smallpox virus, there's the Black Plague bacteria, and the vines are DNA strands. But whose DNA strands? Is it just natives? No, it's a global pandemic. It's affected us all in various ways. We all have family members and friends that we've lost to COVID. Marshall is my friend. I miss him. He made time for me. I'm not anybody, right? But this piece, I wanted it to talk about that shared experience and our shared resilience throughout all of this. So I think when we ask ourselves the question, when does it stop being native art because of evolution shifts in our culture, I would just challenge you a little bit and say it never stops being native art, right? These kids, maybe they lost their language. Maybe they didn't have their traditional clothing for a while. Maybe they weren't able to participate. Some never got to go home and participate in their culture. Maybe they wore suits and dresses, but they never stopped being native. And I think it's the same for our art. So it's just kind of a final slide that I wanted to talk about. You know, these narratives, they're so important to us as artists as we look at our place in this country amongst a majority culture, while we tenaciously hold on to our own through our art forms. I just challenge you, look at art a little differently. These big hairy man pictures, the classic Patty photo, this Sasquatch mask, I like to think I'm in good company. We're telling that same narrative, that same fascination of a creature that's highly elusive. I only use the finest Sasquatch hair from my people on my dad's side. But art can be exciting, and I really hope you do engage a little deeper. And thank you so much for being here and having this conversation with us. I hope you have a few questions. I may not have the answers, but I can point you to James or Rick or somebody a lot smarter than me, and we'll figure it out. Thank you.